session focused on the technology and data driving this decarbonization and climate progress. And although I was told you can go to our beautiful QR codes, I actually am going to have us each start by talking a little bit about who we are and specifically what we're working on, because I think that's setting the stage for a lot of our conversation today. So I will kick us off. My name is Monica Dean. I am the Climate and Sustainability Practice Director at USC's Dornsife Public Exchange. Public Exchange is you all set me up beautifully in that last round, is an innovative new program at the University of Southern California that is meant to bridge the gap between the public and private sector and research universities. Basically, the question is, there are universities in every city around the world. Why aren't they working more closely with those of you out in the real world trying to solve these problems? And, thank you. Thank you. And the answer is pretty simple. Universities are really massive institutions. They're basically giant little cities into and of themselves. They're full of hundreds of experts, all with their own individual interests, which makes it really hard to navigate. On top of that, you layer in all the different incentives that they have in order to get promotions. So think about faculty who want to get tenure. They have this publish or perish mindset. That doesn't really align with what we were just talking about, with the basic science research of coming up with new chemistries for batteries. That's not a publication. That might take 20 years. They won't get tenure if that's what they're focused on. And so what we're trying to do is build a new model of research collaborations. So afterwards, if you have an idea for a research project, come find me. Because what I do is I make it simple. You come to me with your research question, and I will find you the right researcher. We will work together to design a research project, and we will have our team of project managers help you from start to finish. And if that researcher is not at USC, then I will work with any other university in order to go find them. So we are trying to change how academia is part of the climate solution space. And I am going to hand it over to my co-panelist, Juan, to tell us a bit about Blueberry.
Thank you. Hey, my name is Vaughn Blake. I'm a partner at Blueberry Capital. We're an early and growth stage investment firm focused on the data side of the energy transition. So we're looking at businesses that are leveraging software, data analytics, AI to optimize, enable, protect, facilitate deployment of renewable assets across North America and Western Europe. We're based here in Los Angeles and in Jackson, Wyoming. We're investing out of our third fund now, so been at it for since 2016. So mostly leading seed through Series B deals in post-revenue businesses.
Hi there, I am Jessica Fernandez, and I'm coming from Phoenix, Arizona today, so you all spared me from 104 degrees, which is pretty fantastic. I actually grew up just down the street in Encino, so it's really good to be home. Good to see you all, and this is such a fun event. So I work at Arizona State University, and so one of those really large public universities. That's an R1 institution that has an almost $1 billion research portfolio. I work in the Global Futures Laboratory, which is one of those departments that is kind of the 800-pound gorilla at our university, which is really intending to be the future of sustainability, right? Knowing that there's so many challenges with traditional ways of looking at sustainability, where so much of it is about conserving what we have rather than really looking forward. So something as simple as emissions, where the conventional wisdom is how can we get smaller, how can we reduce less? What we're trying to do is kind of flip that and think about what does a future of opportunity look like. So something like carbon capture, where we're building new industries and we're unlocking all sorts of opportunity and economic opportunities, workforce development areas that don't even exist yet. And then really trying to put the pedal to the metal in creating, hopefully a future that has more opportunities than less. So my specific unit is Decision Theater within the Global Futures Laboratory. And so our responsibility there is to transform decision making. So I imagine maybe a little bit, I'll dive into, or maybe we'll do it now. Go through a couple of slides.
Formal crap.
Awesome. So our mission is, at its core, we're transforming decision making. I could almost cut out the rest of the mission statement after that. And what I mean by that is that we know that there's entire fields dedicated to decision science, team science, intelligent teaming, things like that. But how do you actually get people to make decisions is really kind of that hat trick. So the way that we do it is through data visualizations, data analysis, and it's really one of those keywords is co-creation. So what we're doing is typically taking some of those messiest problems that exist. So for example, what should the future of water in the Southwest look like? What is the correct answer? And of course there is none, and there's some really well-funded, influential opinions that are going to have a lot to say on that. And so our job is to be able to bring in folks from, that typically every project's representing some kind of multi-sector representation. So we're going to have folks from industry, we're going to have folks from government that are typically the ones contracting these projects. And we're going to have tons of folks from academia, of course, being at ASU. And then what we're doing is we're building these big data models that are powered by tons of data. We're asking people to contribute their data. And we are building 7-screen visualizations in order to figure out, not necessarily consensus of what the best answer is, but how can we get that shared understanding with people at the table that are very rarely at the same table in order to figure out what the next right move is. So there's all sorts of challenges that we're able to cover. Decarb is one of them. But I'll talk a little bit about the kind of iterative loop. So I won't read the slide too, but you'll see there's a bunch of data and tech that's on the bottom of that kind of trifecta. And what really is our unique identifier is this human-centered design. So we are not the best data analysis group in the entire world by any stretch of the imagination. We have a ton of experts. But what we really are is this really powerful convening institution. So being able to bring these people into the same room, being able to look at the same models, contribute their data, and if someone's coming in saying that they know what the correct answer is, we say, that's fantastic, let's test it. Let's stress test it and see if it actually works. So by being able to bring these multiple groups together, this is really where that change typically happens. So it's oftentimes quite a slow process. So we have a 3-part prototype. Where we're able to kind of create the bones of the actual data-powered project, so that's the data architecture. That's what's going to be that informs our scenarios and models, which we're able to actually really rapidly turn around into what you'll see is a regional transformation method. So what we mean by that is that we try to look at challenges not defined by just political boundaries, right? We like to call them problems without passports. So climate change isn't only restricted to Arizona, nor is it only restricted to California, of course. And so we're instead trying to look at a regional lens and be somewhat agnostic of those political boundaries. So for example, we had a delegation from Bulgaria recently. Weirdly enough, Bulgaria and Phoenix actually have very similar challenges in terms of climate change, in terms of workforce development challenges, changing economies. So what we're able to do is really rapidly deploy a bunch of our models into different regions quite quickly. And so these are just some of the topic areas that you're going to see that circle around that regional transformation core concept. And what we wind up finding more than anything is when you start to pull the thread on one of those, then you're inherently going to be pulling the thread on another. So for decarbonization in our bottom technosphere, we know for sure we're going to be impacting the environment depending on what we do and which way we're plussing up or plussing down. So we're going to start pulling in things from the biosphere. We know there's going to be entire industries that need to be made, so it's going to be pulling in education and future workforce. So being at an institution like ASU that has about 10,000 faculty and researchers that are world class lets us kind of walk down the street and be able to pull some of that expertise into our models. So in terms of what it actually looks like, see if it'll show you. Maybe it won't. Well, what will pop up, and hopefully just a minute, is the actual 7-screen version of what we call the drum. So at Decision Theater, it's this, there it is. It's this big circular room. It's kind of like a war room style setup where we're able to have 7 massive touch screens. This is not magical tech by any means, but what it is able to do is it's this really immersive way to be able to throw up all sorts of data, have this executive style conference room, and typically what we're doing is we're inviting stakeholders every 2 weeks or so in order to come, play with the model, see the data, put their data in, test their assumptions. There's typically tons of things they're able to mess around with, and play out different scenarios to see what's going to work, what's not, and what are those opinions that they likely haven't considered before in the past. It's amazing to me, even folks within the same industry that very likely wind up not meeting each other until they're in that room specifically. We know that we're pretty limited though in terms of being able to bring people into Tempe's itself for this decision theater. So there's a couple different formats that we've been playing with for decision theater itself. So there's a policy decision theater we have in DC. It's obviously going to be very, very focused on policy itself. We have a mobile version where we actually have these carts we're able to wheel around all these screens, and then we kind of have this hyper-mobile version that has 7 short-throw projectors that we're able to pack up into a briefcase, so we actually have it on the big island of Hawaii right now. And so being able to bring kind of this decision theater matrix out into the world has been really powerful, and so keep joking, we're wondering what our LA one is, but I'll pause there and we can head on to the next question. Thank you.
Okay, so both have talked a little bit about how data is influencing decision making, whether it's an investment, whether it's policy making, and how that can't be really done in isolation, right? So if we pull on one thread of data, it might have an impact on another sector. So for the sort of bringing together the last panel we heard and this data concept, I'd be curious for where you all see data and technology as being really important for the industrial decarbonization discussion. And specifically, what new capacities or insights do you think data or decision theater, as it were, can be applied to this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we see the world through a relatively specific lens within the climate tech space, and we see data as a way to enable the scalability or deployability of a certain solution, right? So whether that's something on the generation side, the clean generation side that helps actually power industries with cleaner power, or if it's in some cases like a way in which you can mitigate the overuse of a certain resource, right? So in that regard, thinking of one of our businesses, Hydrosat on the water side, that leverages remote sensing data in order to better inform large-scale agricultural use of irrigation. And then more on the refrigeration and it's more like the traditional industrial side, a business that we're investing in called Axiom Cloud that does the same thing to sort of leverage leak detection and temperature management for refrigeration across both cold storage as well as grocery. So yeah, I mean, our model is sort of based around, like I said before, trying to identify technologies that can actually scale, that can actually be deployed in a way that's cost effective. And in our view, generating returns is what will lead to the best path for climate mitigation, as opposed to sort of investing in something and hoping that it's going to be the one out of a trillion shot.
So when I think of the role of data and tech in decarbonization, right, I think we're drowning in data, and I'm sort of like not the first person to have pointed that out in the world, that there is so much information, there are massive data sets that exist and are likely oftentimes untouched. And so when I think of decarbonization, I think of it as this three-dimensional problem, right? That it's not linear, otherwise it would be way easier to solve, as tempting as it is to see it as a linear problem. So when we're using data, we're thinking of it as a boundary object. So the way that we would define that is that really that means it's something to react to. We know that data is not going to solve the problem in and of itself. Data is not making decisions, people are making decisions. And it sounds quite trite, but it's really an important distinction to know that very rarely, if ever, is data going to actually be able to tell us what the right answer is, because the moment we get the actual stickiness and difficulty of humans involved is when things start to fall off and the wheels kind of come off as well. So seeing data as a tool, and that's what it is, data is a tool in order for people to make decisions, and in order to have decisions, we need to have lots of trust, we need to have lots of collaboration kind of along the way. So being able to have data as something to react to, and for people to test their assumptions, and that people likely have very deeply entrenched beliefs, totally understandably, even though ASU wants to always position itself as this honest broker of information as a university, we're not lost upon the fact that we have our own biases too. So being able to have data is hopefully something that's relatively objective, something that allows other people to put their data sets in, and that it winds up kind of being this amalgam of everything in the room. Lets us kind of have this ball in the middle that we can bounce around, and is hopefully something that we can kind of play ping pong with a little bit. And so seeing data as a tool, and it's not the end all be all, has really been one of our transformation like core concepts at Decision Leader.
I think that's pretty helpful in terms of, yeah, at the end of the day, data, the phrase that I always used to utter when I was a policymaker is it's data-informed decision-making, right? Like, you cannot ask the data to take the decision for you, and the best you can do is hope the data validates the decision you want to take, but as a policymaker, sometimes I am going the exact opposite way of what the data shows, and so that doesn't always work out the best way. And I think the other aspect of data and technology, because they gave me a broad topic for this session, is that, yeah, exactly, how to narrow this, is that the trust aspect, right? Like, data inherently comes with different perceptions, can be open to interpretations in different ways, and so one of the things that I've seen recently, especially in the academic sector, is we're producing a lot of data dashboards. Oh my gosh, there are so many dashboards I can't even keep track. Or when I talk to the city, there's a new dashboard for every single greenhouse gas or each sector. None of them are talking to each other. And then we're just going to publish them. I'm going to publish them on the website, and I'm going to assume that you, general citizen of Los Angeles who doesn't know anything about climate, can interpret this and know what it means. And so I might pose this question back to you. I spend a lot of time working with community engagement and making sure we're helping translate the data and technology for communities so that they can feel involved, so that they can have a say in what this data means for their lives. And I'd be curious in your work, for either of you, how much is that data translation piece coming into play? How important is it to, let's say, spend that time and energy in doing either user testing, community engagement, in order to help make sure that the data is getting interpreted in the way that, you know, it's intended. We'll phrase it that way.
Yeah, I'll try to take that question, I guess, from like the a practical lens. So, one of the issues that we're dealing with, especially here in California, is the departure of insurance companies for home insurance as a result of wildfires. Now, obviously, there's multiple layers of risk that are built into a large insurer's model, and there are reasons beyond their exposure to, broad-scale catastrophic risk that are resulting in, the sort of departure from California. But one of the ways that we've seen data inform a solution to that problem is through our portfolio company, Delos, which is using proprietary data model based around just more inputs, around type of brush, weather patterns, type of stone, just environmental factors that are not inputs into traditional insurers' risk assessment models. And as a result, they've been able to move into places that all of these insurers have pulled out. They've been able to take home insurance take homes out of the California Fair Plan, which is state subsidized, and more cost effectively insure them. And that business has grown tremendously, and it's not a result of, obviously the grit and the determination of the entrepreneur, obviously the support of the capital partners around the table, but ultimately the biggest, the most important factor of the success of that business is just more robust and granular data. So, yeah.
Awesome. So one of our favorite quotes is that all models are wrong and some are useful, and I'm sure most people have heard that in this room. But yeah, so one example project would be in, as you can imagine, in the greater Phoenix area and in so much of Arizona, there are a ton of heat deaths every summer. Oftentimes from folks experiencing homelessness, that it's just, there's no escape. Even at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's going to easily be exceeding 105 degrees. There was a couple attempts by different city governments in order to do kind of a top-down control method of opening up cooling centers. So basically places where people can go in, they can get water bottles, there's air conditioning, there's no cost. And just trying to open up kind of within different vacant buildings to have city-managed cooling centers. Wound up being wildly unsuccessful, even though there was a lot of funding into a marketing campaign for it, distributing information as best they can. Decision theater was brought in, and what we were able to do was nothing magical by any stretch, but was just kind of creating a really basic agent-based model on that net logo, something very simple, which was basically just mapping what the temperature throughout the day is. So you'll kind of see this heat map ebb and flow from red to blue in the coolest parts of the day. And then we have there's also a program for businesses to be cooling centers. So for a small amount of money, they would kind of have this agreement that they would keep their doors open, they would have water bottles, they would allow folks in even if they weren't purchasing anything. And what we were able to do was kind of go around to the different businesses that had opted into this program and show them this pretty basic model that literally just shows when their doors are opening, so it shows when the businesses are open and their hours are on. And when those peak temperatures are hitting. And so the really obvious trend that wound up emerging is that about 5 p.m., which is when it's the hottest point in the day in Phoenix, is when a lot of businesses are shutting down. And so there was suddenly this kind of decentralized approach where business owners who know each other that are within the same area of a couple block radius were able to turn to one another and say like, oh, I can keep my doors open for an extra hour at the end of the day. I can open mine up actually an hour earlier. And so without this top-down control, there was suddenly this kind of this spring of a network that was able to pop up, but that was only because they were empowered with the information. Everyone really wanted to be doing their part in order to help this community, and they just didn't know. And so without that information, this is truly that evidence-based decision-making in order to be able to provide, hopefully, a really information-rich environment where our job is not to provide answers because we certainly don't know them. We are not the experts in heat mitigation by any stretch, and so by being able to give people that do have that power, that information, it was just a really basic intervention. So that wouldn't have happened without kind of deep partnerships in advance and making sure that we knew who were we even attempting to talk to as we're building these fancy models, because we have certainly fallen into that trap where we have fancy dashboards that have live links and they look awesome, and then we monitor the traffic and then no one logs on again after the grant cycle runs out. So we're really disinterested in that and really trying to make things that are hopefully valuable in time memoriam. So just one example from Decision Theater.
I'm going to ask the controversial question, and I'll volunteer myself first. But I would like an example of maybe where this went poorly, or where the data and technology results didn't come out as intended. Because I think too often what we do is we talk about the success stories, we don't talk about the lessons learned from things that didn't go as planned. And so I'll give you an example, because I'm asked a hard question, I should be willing to answer it. We are still working with the City of Los Angeles on their urban greening project. So it's sort of a classic example where the mayor came out, Mayor Garcetti, and said, we're going to plant 90,000 trees by 2028, and everyone's like, yay, go you, we love trees. Great. We wake up the next day and we say, where are you planting these 90,000 trees? And what qualifies as a community of need? Because that's what you said you were going to prioritize. And so we went around and we pulled together a bunch of data, built a bunch of dashboards and a bunch of mapping to identify what are the priority communities, where do they need to start planning, and we got all the way down to the city block level, and we said, okay, great, these are the streets you should plant first. These are the routes that students are taking to go from their house to their local elementary school, or the routes that they're taking to get to their bus stop, and where they should really need shade. All makes sense, totally based off of science. And then we go to a community engagement session in order to get feedback. And does everyone want to guess the answer? No, I cut through the alley over there because it's, cooler, there's more shade, or it's faster, or there's a giant hill and I don't want to go that way. And so we had to readjust all of our models for real world assumptions that we didn't have. And so I think it's a good example of the data can tell you something and it can be totally inaccurate for how it's going to get used in the real world. And so I'd be curious how you guys are dealing with sort of that data technology meets reality gap?
Yeah, I think just to echo what you just mentioned, as well as something that Jessica said much earlier, which is that we're living in the real world, and ultimately it's humans that need to leverage the decision making that should be or could be informed by that data. I think what comes to mind for us is probably a business that we invested in on the waste to value side. Basically taking anything from tires to chicken feed to any form of waste, and turning that into some sort of valued product, whether that's heat or what have you. Great entrepreneur, great software platform, great data, but ultimately, who are the folks that have historically been taking advantage of the distribution of that waste? Folks that were not extremely inclined to be as data-driven as the creator of the business was. So, despite best efforts, that was a business that just really couldn't make it, right? And just an example of how if humans aren't taking advantage of the data, then the data's not altogether as useful as it may seem.
So yeah, just a quick example. Yeah, this one is not going to blow any minds by any means, but so Decision Theater, this has been a couple of years ago. We got this massive grant to do a pretty ambitious education project funded by the Helios Foundation, and it was for a few $1 million. And there was this really ambitious goal in order to this top level charge of how do we get to 60% post-high school degrees across Arizona. So it's a really fantastic goal, kind of on its face. So this was a multi-year project. We were collecting all sorts of data. We were kind of doing our typical due diligence of being able to have folks that were school administrators, and then folks that are in industry that are going to be influencing tons of things within schools. We had policymakers, we had parents, we had a really good kind of cross-set of folks that were helping us build this model. And so they were coming in every 2 weeks, they were contributing their data, lots of strong opinions, lots of amazing insights. And it was about 6 months in that was the first time that it was raised of which 60% of Arizona should be having this uptick in which to have a post-high school degree. Does that matter? Is it any 60%? And as small and potentially silly as that sounds, that challenged nearly every assumption that we had in the model in which we were making, and had already invested about 6 months worth of time.
So I'd be really curious for what advancements in data and technology are you most excited about? Where do you see changing opportunities, and how do you think it'll shift, again, sort of the goal of today's conversation, decarbonization or other climate objectives? And again, I'm happy to go for it and buy you some time while you think about that. But one of our projects right now is on the LA River, which has been the same since 1930, when they first channelized it and put in all those concrete walls. And we have a project right now with our engineering school, with our landscape architecture school, and with our cinematic arts school, in order to use augmented reality with community engagement. So giving community members the chance to visualize what a new engineered LA River could look like. And we've done some initial user testing, and the results are incredible. So it's all done up to engineering standards, but suddenly we get to consensus a lot faster about what a different LA River design could look like, bringing together data, engineering, and augmented reality in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all the foundational model stuff applied to the climate / energy and earth perspective is pretty interesting. I think it's probably relatively early until we really see where those breakthroughs will meet the road in terms of both being investment worthy, return worthy, as well as the actual climate impact. But we've been taking pitches from folks that are doing vector databases for geospatial, that are doing like large language models that can, or foundational models that can be utilized for the entire operation of basically digital twinning Earth. So all of those things I think are really, really interesting and will lead to probably some breakthroughs down the road. It's still early days, however.
Yeah, so similarly, the things that are getting us fired up are, and I'm thinking somewhat near term, not super far out by any means. But one of them is definitely digital twins. So we have a couple different digital twins where ASU has massive partnerships with Unity, the gaming platform company, which is of course one of the big powerhouses behind digital twins. For those that aren't familiar with it, it's basically just a visual representation of some kind of physical asset and putting it into some kind of 3D modeling software. And so that's been used for decades, and they're getting more and more sophisticated to the point where there's entire cities that are now digital twinned, meaning that they have all of their built environment that's mapped into a virtual world. So they have water systems, they have the electric grid, they have road infrastructure, all the whole 9 yards, and so it's an incredible feat to be able to pull that all together. So Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix and Tempe sit, is in the midst of kind of building our first digital twin, which is really exciting. But to me, what's even more exciting is actually being able to embed a lot of social behavior data, and so being able to embed not just built environment, but then tons and tons of movement patterns and the way people behave with the built environment. ASU is in the midst of launching our first medical school, which is really exciting. And so things like how do we minimize the heat exposure index for people that are navigating the streets of Phoenix, which unfortunately many people have to. Are there ways that we can optimize those pathways, that we can provide some kind of predictive analytics of what are going to be the cooler parts, and be able to provide kind of not only personalized medicine, but precision medicine, and being able to really offer some personalized custom pathways. Whether it be something as relatively straightforward as navigating the city in extreme temperatures. Second quick thing that's really exciting too is just obviously LLMs are all the rage right now, and so we are embedding more and more virtual assistants within our models as well. So being able to build custom GPTs that are able to ingest huge bodies of academic literature, white papers, industry papers, all sorts of things, in order to have it be this custom kind of support system that when there's not an expert in the room, that hopefully there's at least someone or something we can tap that can provide a little bit more information. So that's something that we're rolling out pretty quickly and has been exciting in TT.
Okay, questions?
So I feel like coming from like a startup perspective, there's a lot of focus on using data and testing to make actionable changes, whereas in a lot of bureaucracies, whether it's government or academia or large corporations, there's a lot of modeling. And it's very clear that when you test and move forward and build and move forward and iterate, that can be a lot more successful than modeling. And oftentimes the modeling leads to failure, such as the case of the trees. Instead of just planting trees and see what works, there's all this time spent and you still don't have any trees. Not to getting out your tree thing. But so like what's going to shift data practices to be more towards what consumers of that data want? What's going to shift academia to be more kind of like testing out actual solutions versus modeling, and same with government?
Yeah, I mean, just really briefly, only speaking from the university side, that what we have at ASU, I think we're at 9 now, 9 design aspirations, which are kind of like, it's more than our charter, but it really is meant to be that kind of like the triple helix of ASU in terms of what is the DNA that's actually pointing each individual project. One of those is use-inspired research, so that is absolutely fundamental to almost all of our projects. It's not to say that there isn't basic research that happens around our university, because it certainly does, but that is increasingly incentivized at the university level, so there's even transformations happening to the nod previously of tenure packages, and can that actually be something where it's not only your H-index that's going to be what gets you promoted, that you're able to show this wider portfolio and how you're actually influencing the community. So embedded, and that winds up coming both from top down and bottom up, so our president is very explicit in terms of that there better be a use for your research. Not uniformly, there's going to be some exceptions to that, but there's also just this pretty exciting culture, I think, from around the university, that there is that positive pressure to make sure that your research is actually doing something that affects something out in this world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to build on what you said and maybe provide more context, but I think ASU and USC is also on that path as well. There's a change happening in universities right now. there is a culture shift, and part of it comes to the conversation we just had before, which is the funding going to universities for research is decreasing. The federal budget this year went down for university for National Science Foundation research grants. That's a problem. And what it means is that a lot of universities are rethinking, how do we get funding for research? And they're turning more and more to these private partnerships or other, use-inspired cases of research. That'll allow more of that real-world testing, because what you aren't usually inspired to do in a federal research grant or other research, traditional academic funding, is go plant the trees yourself. So we just got a grant so that we could go plant the trees ourselves, just to move past that, but that required private philanthropy. There is no federal grant that we could have won that would have said, yes, do research and go plant trees. It just isn't how that funding works. So as the incentives and culture and role of universities change in this world, as we recognize them for what they are, which is bastions of ideas that could be applied, and force them to actually start applying those, maybe we'll see more of that. Yeah, another question.
Aaron Fike, Finline Capital. I run a data analytics and software focused climate change fund. Vaughn, do you come across companies that have highly valuable but highly static data, and then so I'll give you an example of this. I found a company that they took a bunch of cell phone information, they knew where everyone was, and then they overlaid it where the grid was, and they found all the best spots to put in EV charging. Okay. The problem is, they made a map, and once they make the map, that's it. They show someone where the map is, and the company shuts down. There's no ongoing subscription service to the map. There's no way to monetize that. And I've seen not-for-profits and governments do that kind of work, but more than once I've come across a company that has this, but there's no.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. I think we've come across. I know a number of companies that are doing just that, so I probably know which company.
Same ones.
Yeah, and there's just a difference, I think, between building for a commercial opportunity and leveraging data to showcase that data, right? And one would think that if you were informed enough from a data science perspective to create the map, that the idea that this lack of dynamicism within that data set would be a bit alarming, right? But apparently not.
So I'm an economist. Data is a love language of mine, and then I'm also a climate professional, and data is the power, load that we didn't accurately forecast. So I wasn't quite right. What are you all doing? What do you think? What do you think needs to be done in terms of different companies, different tech, policy, or finance around the power loads from data processing centers?
So well, we've done a lot of work in this space over the course of the last 18 months or so, trying to find both opportunities to invest that bring some level of energy efficiency to compute. We've looked from I always say we've looked from hourly recs all the way down to the silicon and pretty much everything in between. And I think ultimately where we've landed from an actionability perspective is that right now, there's a lot of fragmentation between each of the stakeholders involved with building and putting data centers online. In most cases, the data center developers want to put the data centers in the ground or sell the project, what have you, as fast as quickly as possible. And on the consumption side, the folks that need the data centers just want to get them to work. So I think I think we're at the beginning of the deployment stage of this next wave, where there's a lot of questions about ROI, there's a lot of questions about long-term impact, both financial, climate-wise, etc. But just from a behavioral standpoint, it's just going to be a sort of situation where we're deploying, and then we'll probably try and figure out how to bring efficiency to them later, which is probably not the most optimistic way to describe it, but I think it's extremely real.
Yeah, and for our end, I want to get back to you in like 4 to 6 months because we're literally doing a project exactly on this right now, at least in part. Right, yeah, because of the CHIPS Act, Arizona is definitely one of those big winners in terms of massive movement of like the semiconductor industry also coming out to Arizona. And so we have this large project that's spearheaded by SRP, one of our major utilities within Arizona. And there's kind of this larger coalition of a lot of utility companies that obviously all have their own net zero targets, typically by 2050. And there's this huge appetite to get there, but there's also these massive constraints of not only things like population growth and climate change stressors, but then also huge industrial growth in Arizona that is really making the math not make sense. So how can we actually visualize that to realize basically how much we're likely underperforming even in our most optimistic projections of how our load growth is going to be able to meet those demands. So that's part of actually, yeah, we're literally, we'll probably have a call this afternoon on it, so hopefully I can provide better information in a couple months.
I think the other important piece, putting on my very former hat when I worked at the IPCC, but progress on climate is not going to be linear, right? It is not going to be the way that we want to see it, and we will have setbacks. And so there will be years where, emissions are going to keep going up even though they're supposed to head down. And I think AI and the demand that we're seeing there is a really good example of that. And until we can figure out how to make those data centers or demands more energy efficient, please, and renewable energy load is provided, we have to just bear that gain, because ultimately AI and data processing will be a force for good in so many different ways in this sector. So I think, the progress is not linear, but doesn't mean it's not a good solution.
Yeah. I think ultimately we'll have a massive increase in emissions as a result of this build out, and then, once we have scale, the solutions to our problems will probably lie within that very build out, right? So.
Other questions?
Yeah, going back to what you mentioned regarding the lessons learned about tree planting in Los Angeles, why do you think could solve that problem of translating data-driven recommendations to actual real application? Because I think it comes up often. And it might be that we just need to bring the right stakeholders early on, right? So that we take community as a data point to our recommendations, but just curious as to where you think could help in those instances.
Yeah, that definitely was our main takeaway, which is we should have done community engagement sooner in the process to validate the assumptions that we were putting into this model. And in a lot of ways, it's difficult working with communities. You don't want to be extractive. You don't want to always be going to them with something and they aren't seeing results. So those communities we did those initial consultations with still haven't seen trees, right? It will be embarrassing for me to show up again and ask them that same exact question. And so I think part of it is really saying, we're in this with you, we're going to bring you in early, and we're going to stick with you until we actually see the trees in the ground. And so a lot of it is dedicating that time and putting in that energy to make it a more wholesome process that actually will deliver the results. Overall though, I think this is a problem that I see across sort of the data sector, which is there's not enough human factors in the data that we're designing. So it's sort of the same thing I would pick on the insurance and wildfire risk, right? We all know everyone in this room anyway, knows wildfires are increasing, they're more frequent, they're more severe. It's not altering a lot of people's behaviors and where they are living or what homes they are purchasing. And it's going to be a question of how we will see the insurance market bear out on changing that decision-making process. But how do we leverage that in our decisions? How do we show that risk in the data? So, now you go to Redfin and there's a feature that tells you how vulnerable a home might be to various climate risks. Is that data bearing out? Could it be designed in a different way that elicits a different reaction? I don't know, but I'd be curious for your take.
Yeah, I don't really know exactly what the question is, I guess.
If there's better ways of integrating human feedback into data and design.
Oh, yeah. I think certainly. I think that the thing that both investors and entrepreneurs need to take into account is just that the platonic ideal of a data model is never going to occur, right? point earlier, right? Like all data models are wrong. It's just a question of how wrong they ultimately are in practice. So, you know, one, I think being a little bit more detail-oriented around the type of data acquisition that's done, and making sure that you're leveraging a number of other factors than what's been traditionally. I'm thinking of the insurance specifically. Like one of the biggest issues there is that with Delos, they've never had a wildfire loss, but you know half of their map would be outside of the bounds of traditional insurance. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess if it's a model that has not been built with stakeholder engagement and you can't turn back the clock, then what I'm thinking what Decision Leader would do is basically use it as a tool, so use it as a boundary object, whatever model there is and whatever data that is informing it currently, and then kind of starting to shop it around with stakeholders and beating up the model with them and saying, what's wrong with it? What's wrong about this model? What data is missing from this model? And really, I mean, and sincerely asking them of what are the flaws here, and then it's then typically going to be our job to either improve it or to at least kickstart the conversation and let this be the thing that that's the Trojan horse, if you will. That's the vehicle for conversation that actually gets the decision makers or the influencers within the same room to have something to react to even kind of kickstart that conversation. So it still has utility, I think, and it can be even used for the what's wrong with it kind of version of the conversation.
Okay, last question.
This might be more for Vaughn, but kind of even broadly for the panel. So I'm also like an early stage investor, and what I'm trying to get is like, we can tell the impact story. Okay, this much CO2 abatement, this kind of community impact, whatever. Is there kind of a movement? I'm even trying to think about it for my own fund or firm. Like when I'm building my portfolio of companies, how does this add up to the fund as a whole in terms of impact? Kind of like a Morningstar, 3-4 star thing, right? We can tell the story, but sometimes they have to be like, okay, what is this? Like, what is this doing right now in a word or a rating or something?
Yeah. I mean, I think I get what you're sort of driving towards. I can just tell you, you know, what we do, and it may be helpful for you in terms of, you know, your memo preparation. So we link all of our investments to the UN SDGs, as well as try and create, and sometimes it can be difficult, you know, some sort of, you know, at scale carbon reduction target for each business. Now that can be a little tricky, and you know, sometimes businesses don't necessarily translate perfectly to that particular metric. The SDG thing is usually something that we can like lean on in that case. I think just the thing that you want to avoid is you know, being either overly prescriptive or falsely precise around that stuff, because at a certain level, you come across a certain investor, they'll be able to call you out, and you know that just creates an element of distrust that you don't want to put out there. So yeah, I mean, not overdoing it essentially, but trying to find ways in which each investment does express itself within, you know, the goals of the fund's thesis.
Thank you, everyone.